So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a Wavell Room and project for the study of the 21st century event. There have been some minor, I will have to say, a few little quibbles with our internet connection here. It wouldn't be a study for the 21st century without it, I have to say. So I am Tammy Evans. I am one of the senior fellows at the Atlantic Council, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you all to this event on climate change and the future of defence. We were hoping to have Charlotte Bratby here to do a bit of the introduction, but instead you've got me. And so one of the things I'd like to just open up for you all here is a little bit about the background to this event. As the UK's leading open forum on defence and international security, it gives me therefore great pleasure to say that today we are discussing the future of UK defence policy and climate change and sustainability. So the Wavell Room is made up of a number of volunteers, of which Charlotte Bratby, who has been hosting all of this, I must say a big thank you to her, even though she's not quite online at the moment, have been able to put this event together. So I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for joining us today. And so as part of that, it is meant to be an open discussion, and what we would like you to do, therefore, is to be able to ask some questions. There is the means for you to do that. There's been a Google form that some of you have put some questions in already, and we've received some of those. But if you want to pose questions further during the time of the event, then please do so. So to move further on, apart from the questions in the chat, I'd like to just let you know that we are delighted to announce that the Wavell Room is again partnering with PS 2021, that's the Project for the Study of the 21st Century, for a one-day event on building cyber and the grey zone, which is currently scheduled for the 22nd of March. Further detail for that will follow. And just before that, politely would like to remind you that at the mercy of our internet connections, which have been plaguing us today, we do apologise for any technical interruptions that we may experience right now. And there will be a bit of rebroing going on for those of you who are familiar with that term. So a little bit about myself, Tammy Evans, as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I am also a British Army officer. I've spent the last 20 years of my civilian career in security sector reform and security sector justice. And I have a personal background as well in climate change, environmental efficiency and security. So quite a broad background for me with an advocacy and public information background as well. But beyond me, what we really have here is our panelists and our keynote speaker, Lt Gen Richard Nugee. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to kick off with a question just to get the conversation going once General Nugee has given his opening address. General Nugee is currently the Climate Change and Sustainability Lead for Defence, with the express role of writing a report and review of Defence's approach to the effects of climate change on defence and the effect of defence on climate change, so both sides there. Prior to this, he was the Chief of Defence People for 4 years, responsible for the central policies for all serving personnel, regulars and reserves, as well as Defence's civil servants, families and veterans. Before this role, he had both operational roles and staff roles, predominantly in the personnel area. Our other panellists today, of which we have 4, we have Rear Admiral Andrew Burns, who is the Director Develop of the Royal Navy. Rear Admiral Andrew Burns was appointed to Director Develop in December 2019. He's responsible for the conceptual and force development of all maritime capabilities and for designing the future mix of capabilities to meet Royal Navy outputs and the challenges of the operating environment. As the Navy Command 2-star Climate Change and Sustainability Champion, he chairs the Navy Command Climate Change and Sustainability Group. With us also today, we have Major General David Southall, Director, Army Basing and Infrastructure. Major General David Southall currently serves as the Army Director, Basing and Infrastructure and has full responsibility for the Army's built estate and Defence's training estate. He's also the Army's Sustainability Champion, committed to ensuring that the Army plays its part in meeting the UK's commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. through reducing energy demand as well as increasing green supply across the Army estate. From the Royal Air Force, we have Group Captain Maurice Dixon, who is the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Astra Sustainability. He is the Air Force's Air Command lead for developing and delivering the RAF Net Zero by 2040 strategy, their action plan and implementation programme. He is tasked to deliver an integrated and coherent net zero air power capability transition and delivery approach that equals or enhances delivery of air power. This includes coordinating all the defence lines of development touchpoints across the RAF, net zero estate, RAF net zero aviation, and embedding net zero business as usual for RAF business transformation across behaviours, processes, and decision making. Finally, but certainly not least, we have with us Dr. Lesley-Anne Duvich-Powley, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Law at King's College, London. Dr. Lesley-Anne Duvich-Powley is also the Deputy Director of its Climate Law and Governance Centre. Her research looks at the international legal dimensions of environmental degradation, and in particular, the preventative duties of states to avoid harm. Lesley-Anne is also interested in the legal and policy implications of the objectives set by the Paris Agreement and regularly attends climate conferences of the parties. So with COP26, of course, coming up later this year. Prior to joining academia, Lesley-Anne worked in various defence and security think tanks, including London's Royal United Services Institute and Geneva's Centre for Conflict Development and Peace Building, where she researched piracy and other maritime security challenges. So with that, the introduction to all of our panellists, I'm very pleased now, of course, to be able to hand over to General Richard, who will give us our keynote opening address. Thank you very much. Over to you, General.
Tammy, thank you very much indeed. And
the other speakers, if Andrew, Leslie and Maurice could give me a wave if they can hear me. Great. And so perhaps if I offer a few opening remarks on behalf of General Richard. He has led, as Tammy introduced, MOD's climate change and sustainability strategy. That strategy is being staffed through the Ministry of Defence last month and this, and I suspect he would wish me to say that we expect that to be issued in days, not weeks and months, probably in line with the issue of the Defence Integrated Review, command papers and white papers. But perhaps if I kick off, whilst we wait for General Richard to dial back in, with a little bit of context with regard to the Army's position. As Tammy says, I look after the Army's estate, the built estate and the defence training estate. And so why am I the climate change and sustainability champion? Because the Army estate and the defence training estate is about 2% of the UK landmass. It covers about 500,000 hectares. It's about 20,000 buildings. And for the Army, the climate change, primary climate change challenge is where 2/3 of our carbon emissions lie. And that's within the estate. 64% of our emissions over 500,000 tonnes per year is estate-based. I think you'll hear a slightly different pitch from Andrew and Maurice to a degree, where their challenge is arguably slightly more equipment platform-based. So what are we doing to tackle climate change, and what's our approach? The framing strapline I use with the Army hierarchy is an approach which seeks to think big, start small, but scale fast. So thinking big, our scale of ambition is to deliver by 2050 net zero. What we're aiming to do is to overshoot that, to be carbon saving, to allow offsets for those areas where we might have challenges that we will struggle to meet. Starting small, this year we have a raft of pilots and trials, and the scaling fast is depending upon those successive pilots. We'll seek to invest at scale. So to give you a flavour of those outputs in the following the carbon hierarchy of reducing demand, increasing green supply and offsetting the remainder, we're seeking to reduce demand by energy performance contracts across the estate, changing building standards. We're piloting Defence's first single living accommodation block in Bovington this year. Increasing green supply, we have contracts out for the construction of 4 pilot solar farms this year. Those are being built this year and will cut the ribbons at the end of this calendar year. We have a trial solar panel electrical vehicle charging point on some Army sites, the first one in Andover, and some experimentation in geothermal power too. And in terms of offsets, the training estate has the potential to be to sequester part of our carbon, to use as a significant carbon sink if we can score it. So we're working really closely with other departments. We signed an MOU with the Environment Agency last year to create some coastal habitats that seek to generate and harness the sequestration potential of our estate. So by way of framing introduction, whilst we wait for General Richard to come back online, think big, start small, scale fast. Mainly Army focus on the estate, where 2/3 of our emissions lie. Some exciting pilots and trials in year, and really keen to work with industry and wider government partners to then scale up from those. And I think we'll undoubtedly come back to some of the other areas in the equipment capability in some subsequent questions. But I'm going to stick my thumb up because I don't know if Tammy can hear me, and suggest perhaps we go to you, Andrew.
Thanks, David. I'm not sure if Tammy can still hear us, but if you can hear me, it might be worth just giving me a thumbs up given the problems we've had. That's fantastic. So to lead on what you said, David, what my experience in having a look at climate change and sustainability as it relates to the Royal Navy is I've been really impressed actually in how much activity and positive action is already occurring across Navy Command, and particularly in the naval bases, which we might come on to a bit later. But to give you an example, the naval base in Portsmouth has set up an energy bureau, which has already reduced its energy use by about 50% since 2005. And you can imagine the savings that this is making. And then we're adapting our current capability as well. So some of the platforms we've got in service now will still be in service in the 2040s and 2050s maybe. So we're fitting boss caps to our Type 23 frigates, for instance, which will make them more hydrodynamically efficient, reduce fuel use, and therefore reduce the emissions. So we're taking action on our capability right now, but also thinking about the future. We're also creating a green network across the Royal Navy to mirror the Defence Green Network, because my view is that this mustn't just be top down. We welcome obviously the defence strategy, the policy guidance that will provide, but I think it's important to connect with our people, because as I'm increasingly finding, there is huge enthusiasm for getting after the challenges of climate change and sustainability, and some fantastic individual actions and endeavours that are already underway, and we just need to embrace that and perhaps scale it up. And that's why we're creating this green network across the Royal Navy to harness those ideas. And I think we can be really ambitious as well. So perhaps not just being fast followers, but I think the Navy has an opportunity to lead in defence. And I think that's important because I think we need to signal to prospective employees that we are a responsible employer in respect to climate change and sustainability. That's important not just for recruitment, but I think for retention as well, because we know that the younger generations are really connected with these sort of issues, take them very seriously, and will look at us to see how we are addressing the challenges when they might be considering a job in the armed forces. And then just to discuss a couple of the next steps, I really want to establish an embedding of climate change considerations in our consideration of future capability across all the defence lines of development, because I think we need to do this from the very outset, and each and every DLOD must be sustainable in its own right if the end product, the mix of capabilities we have in the future, is going to address the net zero 50 target, but also to make us a sustainable force in the future as well. I think we have the opportunity to establish some circular economies. About 96% of a frigate is already recyclable, but I think that has to be adopted across a number of other areas as well. And the different mix of capabilities we might have as we embrace technology, particularly autonomy and offboard systems, means that we'll need different materials. And of course, we need to avoid creating another environmental impact as we source some of these materials in a sustainable way. And that again, I think, is why circular economies are important, to make sure we have assured access to some of those materials. And then we're looking at alternative fuels, whether that's hydrogen or synthetic fuels for our propulsion systems, as well as the way we let our contracts in our naval bases and in our training estate, to make sure that they're let in a way which addresses climate change and sustainability principles. And we're establishing some pathfinders in capability as well. So I think our future solid support ships may well be the first vessels in which we put a much more sustainable and climate-friendly propulsion plant. So that just gives you a flavour of the sort of things that we're thinking about and the sort of actions that are already underway across Navy Command.
Andrew, thank you. And if we take the third,
thank you, Admiral Andrew. And I'm not sure if people can hear me again now online. But if they can, then it'd be great now to be able to, of course, to move over to General David to have a look at what the Army is doing with regards to its
So thanks, Tammy. I think you might not be aware we've covered that already. So we've done the Royal Navy, we've done the Army context, and we're going to go now to Maurice and get an air perspective. Maurice, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Group Captain Maurice Dixon. I'm here on behalf of Air Vice Marshal Lloyd, who's the RAF two-star champion, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. But I'll do my best to give you an idea of what the Royal Air Force is up to. So we've, like the other two services, have been reducing our impact on the environment for a few years now by meeting the greening government targets. So we've been reducing energy, reducing fuel, waste, water. So that's been the start of our journey, which we've been doing for about 10 years. And at the moment, we're continuing to do that by taking General Nugee's momentum and taking our sort of ambitions forward. So we're setting up a living laboratory at RAF Leeming, and that's going to be our first, hopefully, net zero airbase by 2025, where we're bringing lots of innovative technology together and trying to take a systems view to see how they integrate. So there's lightweight solar panels, geothermal, waste to energy systems. We've already got electric vehicles there, but hope to have some hydrogen vehicles to start looking at a hydrogen economy and how we move hydrogen into our fleets. And also synthetic aviation fuels, because we can generate synthetic aviation fuels from a number of sources, be they waste, hydrogen, carbon dioxide. So we're looking at new technologies to help us reduce our biggest footprint. So unlike the Army, we have a smaller estate, of which about 25% of our carbon footprint comes from the estate, and about 75% comes from operational fuels. So that's our biggest challenge, and that will take us quite a while to get down to the lower levels. So, like the Army, we are looking to get our estate net negative if we can, so we can build some carbon credits in the bank to buy out the net positive element that will be remaining from aviation. Other things we're doing is there's been some fantastic work down at RAF Bryce Norton looking at reducing fuel in terms of behaviours and planning, flight planning. So two groups saved about £14 million over the last 4 or 5 years in improving pilot behaviours, flight planning, making sure they only take enough fuel on board that they need, and looking at load optimization, so we use the aircraft space really, really efficiently. And on top of that, all our aircraft are now 50-50 synthetic aviation fuel blend approved. And so as soon as we can start using synthetic aviation fuels, we will. The two main challenges, one being availability and one being cost. So the Royal Air Force is working as part of the National Jet Zero Council to help sustainable aviation generally in the UK improve availability of synthetic aviation fuels and its cost effectiveness. We're also looking at a wide range of cleaner energy technology. So we've got RAF Marham, which is already on biogas, and we're looking at 2 other sites, and that's making a huge saving in carbon and cost. So not only are these green savings, they are tangible cost and operational savings as well, because they're allowing us to become more energy resilient, if you like, or self-sufficient from a military perspective and a business continuity perspective. Again, something I'm looking at very seriously for the deployed environment, so that we can operate as self-sufficiently as we can, learning lessons from an exercise the MOD did in 2011 called Power Fob, which was looking at reducing fossil fuel use in Afghanistan, and we were quite successful in that. Solar power is a natural one. We'd love to do wind energy, but unfortunately wind turbines interfere with military radars and civilian radars. So we're working with the renewable energy sector to look at options to overcome that, so we can potentially use wind on MOD sites. Hydrogen again is another energy source, not an energy source, an energy transmission vector, I suppose, which is very adaptable. So once we have hydrogen, we can turn it back into electricity. We can use it as a combined heat and power system. We can refuel directly hydrogen-powered vehicles and obviously turn it into synthetic aviation fuels or even hydrogen fuels for aircraft. And we already have our first aircraft program one of the smaller aircraft that we have, which we're hoping to go straight to electric and hydrogen propulsion from an avgas engine that we have at the moment. So hopefully we'll have the first electric training aircraft flying in 5 to 6 years' time. So all that's coming together in our net zero strategy, which has 3 themes. So net zero negative estate by 2035, net positive by 2030, and as I said, our first net zero airbase just on the estate side by 2025, and net zero aviation and the whole of the RAF by 2040. I think that's probably given you a good flavour, and we'll probably cover quite a few of the other things as we move through the day. So thank you very much from me, and over to Leslie Ann.
Thank you so much. So I thought I would just give a few comments to contextualize this discussion about what the UK in general has been doing in the field of climate change, and what kind of roles I can see for the military in trying to respond to the climate crisis. So I think it is important to say that the United Kingdom is recognized to be a climate leader, not least because of its 2008 Climate Act that is largely considered to be a landmark piece of climate legislation, and that is used as a model worldwide. It has a new target, and this is the first major developed economy to have this target to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Internationally, and I think it's also important while we discuss this notion of climate security, I think it's important to note that it was the UK presidency that actually put the subject on the UN Security Council agenda, and it was thanks to the UK presidency that the notion of climate security was discussed for the first time at the Security Council. Of course, this is important also to recognize that the UK has a historical responsibility in terms of its emission, and also important present capabilities, both technological and financial, that mean that the UK has an obligation to act as a climate leader. So what are the different roles that the military can play in this climate crisis? I think so far we've heard a lot about this very important role of trying to limit greenhouse gases, and we've heard the fantastic work that the military has been doing so far, trying to reduce greenhouse gases. I think there are other roles that are also probably important to discuss, and that would be how the military will be able to respond to the impacts of climate change. So climate change is going to have significant consequences in terms of extreme weather events, disaster relief, storms, floods, and all this calls for the military to be ready to respond to those impacts, be they in the United Kingdom or possibly abroad as well. We can see direct impacts in terms of storm or flood damage, but also trying to respond to more indirect impacts, such as an interruption in supply chains, or even more complex impacts in terms of perhaps a new pandemic emerging as a result of biodiversity loss and changes in species location due to climate change. I think the military also has a third function that will be even more complex in the years to come, and that is to respond to a world that is going to become increasingly unstable. So we know that climate change is a systemic risk, and that there are significant risks of destabilization of the international order. States may be acting in their own narrow interest, self-interest, and this will destabilize and have a destabilizing impact on international peace and security. We might see tensions regarding natural resources, including at sea, or tensions regarding access to water and food. We might also witness a contestation of well-established rules under international law. Sea level rises might actually call into question some well-established rules on maritime boundaries delimitation or navigation rights in the high seas, for instance, or in international straits. We might also see a worsening of political and social conditions in certain countries that are already prone to conflict and are already unstable, and we might witness greater ethnic tensions. So all this actually shows really the complexity of the task for the military when trying to respond appropriately to the climate crisis. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much indeed. I think we've got General Richard back on. I am tracking the YouTube chat. Securocrat reckons that General Richard piled in because he was on ModNet and not on home broadband. General Richard can give me a smile if he can hear me. Given those who were comparing this are struggling with comms, I will steer us through the questions that are coming on live to me on the YouTube chat and also on WhatsApp from you, Ash. So the question, I'll go around the panel next, is the lessons, a lessons question. What lessons have we drawn from our work on climate change, and what can be done to improve how we operate and prevent climate change challenges in the future? I'll go to Andrew first. Then I'll offer a few comments, then to Leslie Ann, if I may, and finishing with Maurice. So, Andrew, lessons, over to you.
Thanks, David. So I think the lesson for me in the work we've done so far is that we need to take action right now. I mean, I think the phrase goes that the best time to take action on climate change was 15, 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And unless we really address what is coming our way, then we are going to be found wanting as a military organisation. So it's important to take action right now, not just because it's now firmly embedded in government policy, but because we've got to be realistic about the way the world is changing around us, as Leslie Ann has clearly indicated. We've got to be able to operate in a changed climate environment and address the challenges that this is going to bring. So there might be freedom of operation challenges as countries adopt governance and rules about the sort of actors who can operate in their area of interest or their territorial waters. That might place limitations on our freedom of manoeuvre. We've got to make sure that our people and systems are resilient to a climate change environment. As someone who's been in a Type 23 frigate in the Gulf in August with no chilled water plants running, I can tell you from personal experience how debilitating this is for our people and the systems in a ship. So we've got to be honest about our ability to operate in certain environments where we have national interests, and we will need to operate in the future. But I am optimistic because of all the good work I've already sort of alluded to that's taking place. But I do think now we absolutely need to embrace all this and scale it up as a command and as a defence organisation, and we need to support all those as best we can to encourage all the excellent work that they're doing. I suppose the other lesson is that we need to lessen our own impact as well, whilst recognising those changing demands that climate impact will have. So there might be a homeland dimension to this. So the calls on the military to deal with the increasing number of flooding events might increase. Certainly, I think there'll be a greater requirement for humanitarian and disaster relief. And I would say, of course, that a forward deployed Navy with presence all around the world will be ready to respond to that. But there are implications on our training to make sure that we are ready to respond in a way that is relevant and timely. And then there's the capability implications of all this as well, making sure they're sufficiently resilient, but also enabling our platforms and people to respond to climate events at the same time ensuring that we don't add to climate change. That in itself is a significant challenge, and we're going to have to create incentives to get that right, and make sure we create the financial headroom to address the way we'll need to adapt our capability in the future. So those are the lessons for me. Over.
Andrew, thanks. I'm going to ask Tammy to give me a wave if she can hear me. No wave seen just yet. Oh, yeah, got you, Tammy. Thank you. So when I've offered a few observations, I'll hand back to you to continue the comparing. But I'll step in if we lose comms again. So in terms of lessons the Army has drawn, I would reinforce what Andrew has stated. I'm getting a bit of feedback. 2 ticks. And that first point about the tyranny of the urgent versus the important, I think, is really key. Still echoing. Tammy, I'll pause and we'll move to Leslie, I suggest, and see if comms improve. No, I think the echo's gone. I'll try again. So, reinforcing Andrew's point, the tyranny of the urgent versus the important. This is the challenge is that we consider this really important, but it's not the pressing issue of the day, week, or month, where the operational pressures or the financial pressures force us into something where urgent trumps important. And of course, it fits both of these. I think the other lesson, expanding on what Andrew highlighted, is we need to take a predict and prevent approach as opposed to a predict and provide, particularly when it comes to military capability. And by that I mean treating the cause, not the symptom. It's all too easy for us to consider climate change responses which are dealing with the outcome in a predict and provide, building higher sea walls, adding more capacity or capability, as opposed to dealing with the root cause and the prevent, fundamentally our carbon emissions, but also the second and third order effects, to ensure we don't self-harm by generating technologies that have a second order effect. And the last lesson, particularly for the Army, I think we as an organisation need to be less insular and more open in working with others, embracing wider public and private sector appetite to address this challenge. This is a collective societal challenge for us all. It's a global challenge. It's a national challenge. It's not something that we can silo as a discrete challenge for an individual government department. And I think perhaps traditionally the MOD, because of the nature of its business, isn't quite as used to that sort of connective tissue with others in industry and the wider public sector. So a lesson for us is to embrace where we can all the goodness and seek to tackle this challenge collectively and not isolate the military into a bespoke response in our own technology arena. Tammy, I can see you nodding, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Tammy. Yes, I think the point about this challenge being a collective problem is very important. And I think we've seen now that climate change is not only a problem for environmentalists, right? It's a problem that really needs to be mainstreamed. And that's one of the challenges. That's why it's just so difficult to actually respond to climate change, because it really means talking to governments and talking also to society and other departments, without at the same time diluting responsibilities. So it's a matter of sharing lessons learned, sharing best practices, while still taking leadership for what is happening within the different governments. I think one of the core difficulties is also in terms of anticipation. I think climate science now is a lot clearer about the impact that climate change is going to have, but I think the implications for security and defense are extremely complex. So we are still operating in a context of scientific uncertainty. Are we looking at a scenario where temperatures are going to increase by 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees? This has significant consequences and implications for what the military is going to be doing in the next few decades. So we must also recognize and account for that type of uncertainty and complexity, and being able, while still taking action as soon as possible, but also making sure that we are able to adapt and adjust over time. I think overall it's also important to, if we consider that climate change is a threat multiplier, to recognize that it might mean that we need to do things that we've already been doing, but we will need to do it more often or on a broader scale. And that's something also that can be significant for the military. It will mean that we will probably have a need to increase military action in terms, for instance, of disaster relief, humanitarian action, etc. So I think those are the kind of challenges that we see when we're trying to govern climate change, on understanding today that we need to take action as soon as possible, but really making the whole decision process very difficult.
Okay, thank you. So I think I'll wrap the two together. We did the lessons learned first. I think the lesson learned, I think, from my perspective, is this is within the normal military way of operating. You know, we do campaign planning. We just have a different campaign to plan now against a different threat. We adapt very quickly to what happens on the battlefield, and we will have to just adapt as to climate change when it comes along. And we're very good at working with coalitions. And so therefore we just have a different coalition to work with now, which goes beyond the traditional coalitions, and it includes industry, society, different ways of delivering the output. So it's not business as usual, but it's well within our DNA to do, and we've been doing it for quite a few years now. You know, we have adapted to climate change with trying to help with the wind industry bring more clean energy to the UK. We've exploited our renewable energy ourselves. We've embedded sustainable procurement, so we start reducing the environmental impact of the equipment that we buy. And we're all currently, developing our campaign plans within the General's campaign strategy, to make the MOD, have a less of an impact. And we also have some military advantages. So, when we do deploy into a disaster area, and I agree with Leslie Ann, is that we will be doing more of this because we are part of society, and we are an arm of the government to help with security. One of the things we can do is when we leave behind, if you like, the renewable energy systems that we've taken there, to allow that community to rebuild itself in a resilient and sort of renewable energy way, rather than going back to the old fossil fuel way of. So we're almost sort of seeding sustainable development as we're helping people get back and reconstituting themselves after a disaster. So to me, that's really good sustainable development. So using the soft power really well. We are starting to work beyond the traditional defence industry as well. So whilst working with our traditional defence partners, we're looking at those innovation sectors within the UK that are rapidly accelerating in sort of the net zero and sustainable development sectors. So renewable energy, data and sort of artificial intelligence. So we're working very closely with the sustainable aviation sector, the civil sustainable aviation sector. I'm learning from Heathrow Airport. They're going down a carbon neutral path. So why would I want to reinvent the wheel? So we're partnering up with, carbon neutral airports and airlines. So airlines are doing very good. They always look at fuel consumption at the bottom line. So while we're flying around, people and cargo, why are we not just flying around as a very efficient airline? So we are working beyond the traditional places. And I agree with the General and the Admiral is that we need to be looking at the cause, and we must become part of the solution and not part of the problem. And we tend to be very good at doing that analysis. But that then brings advantages. So we as the military, yes, we're doing this because we need that social license to operate within society. But actually, there's a very good operational reason for us to do this, because it builds our operational resilience. As the Admiral said, in the future, if we don't change the way the ships emit emissions, we may be excluded from certain ports or certain areas of the oceans and seas that we want to operate in because we can't meet legal requirements. Same on the land and same in the air. If we're emitting too much carbon and we're going into a bit of airspace that has carbon restrictions, that could reduce our operational way of operating. But from my perspective, it's all about improving operational capability as well as contributing to reducing our impact on the planet. So when we deploy, we're more self-resilient. One of the reasons why we're looking at renewable energy in Afghanistan was, we were putting a lot of people's lives at risk, moving fuel around the battlefield, when actually there was lots of solar and wind technology that we started exploiting. So there's a real good operational benefit to do that. And as the Admiral mentioned, looking at cyclic economy, we're actually using our resources far more efficiently rather than buying something, use it and throw it away. We're now looking at the cyclic economy, sustainable design, sort of the industrial symbiosis that one man's waste is another person's resource. So again, that helps with when we're deployed, for the Navy when they're afloat, that they're a little island in their own, and if they can become more and more self-sufficient, so they don't have to do more resupply at sea, they're on target and operations far more, and the enemy can't interdict your logistics line so much. So there are very, very many good operational reasons why we should do it, and also there are a lot of cost benefits as well. So as we become more energy efficient, we're not wasting money on unnecessary buying in of energy, and therefore that allows us to divert some of that funding to maybe some more operationally essential bits of kit. So there's lots and lots of reasons why we should be doing this, and we should be doing it as fast as we can. And that's the reason why the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force are working together to exploit this mutually. And also, if we can accelerate, so one of the reasons we're doing Leeming is we have a partnership with industry and academia. So we as the military are going to trying to accelerate this technology on behalf of the military, yes, but second and third order effects, we would like to accelerate this technology on behalf of the United Kingdom, because we're trying to help the United Kingdom get to net 50 faster, as fast as possible. But obviously, that will hopefully generate jobs and new companies that can then sell this fantastic new technology around the world. So there's a huge benefit on doing this. And I think all the planets are now aligning that everybody sees the benefit, and General Nugee's strategy just brings all that together for us and gives us that sort of guidance and framework within which to move forward in a coherent manner. Over.
Maurice, thank you very much. It's interesting you talk about the planets aligning. Of course, as much as there is space exploration going out there. Actually, of course, there is no planet B for us to go to straight away. So the military advantage, Admiral Andrew, from a naval perspective, what is the military advantage of doing all of this? Over to you.
Well, you could describe climate change as a maneuverist security challenge, and therefore, we must take a maneuverist approach to dealing with it, and we ought to consider what the penalties would be to our operational advantage if we're not honest and realistic about the challenges that it poses. So I've mentioned a couple about the resilience of our people and systems, and that our relative freedom of manoeuvre in areas where different regulations and rules might apply. But I also think that the UK's interests and the geographical mapping of those interests will change as climate change affects geopolitics. And we will need to position ourselves in order to respond. So as government policy responds to changing geopolitics and the way our interests are aligned to those geopolitics, so we will have to play our part in the defence and security of the nation in perhaps a different way than we do at the moment. And therefore, I think we're all in a good position to respond to that. The Navy in particular, but because we are forward deployed, because we are relatively sustainable at sea for long periods of time. But I also think there will be parts of the world which will become more accessible and exploitable. And it might be we find ourselves in competition with adversaries and other nations. And therefore, to defend our rights to access, there might be a military dimension to that. And I think we have to recognise that and adapt accordingly.
I mean, clearly, with all of the naval and the sea route aspects, and as much as competition is one, there's positive and negative competition, and clearly the Navy has a very strong role in ensuring the positive side of competition, especially our economic collaboration, whereas the negative side is one, of course, we don't want to go down. But a lot of this, of course, will take place on land. And that's where, General David, I'd like to hear from you with regards to what is the military advantage, or what advantages can it bring to the military to look at this area? Over to you.
Tammy, thanks. I think it's worth reflecting on. I was very seized by a RUSI quote from one of their last engagements. They described the climate change as not just an environmental issue, nor simply an energy problem, but also a security threat. In a strategic sense and in an operational sense, strategically, global competition for finite resources, and operationally, a whole raft of hard security implications. So I think the hard security implication most pressing is that this is an existential threat to humanity, and those are the UN's words, not mine. And I think we have to keep that context in terms of hard security implication in the broadest definition of security. But I think if you then go to the other end of the spectrum, there are very compelling operational benefits from an army context. If you were to take our contemporary campaigning in Afghanistan, you would find that for every jerry can of fuel in Camp Bastion, it took many multiples more. I forget the precise number, but it was over 100 to get that jerry can of fuel into theatre. It's inefficient and ineffective in a military operational efficacy sense. Wider benefits, if you look outside the estate, take hybrid drives on vehicles, a reduced noise signature, an improved power distribution, improved resilience with multiple redundancies rather than a single engine, and you haven't got those jerry cans of fuel to worry about. So I think from the grand strategic, this is an existential threat. There are hard security implications because it's not just an environmental issue or an energy problem. Coupled with the raft of operational benefits in resilience, in operational efficacy, there is a significant amount that we can use in the efficiency imperative, as well as the moral imperative to do the right thing for the society that we serve. I'll pause there, Tammy, if you can hear me.
General David, thank you very much. Yes, that came through loud and clear, and I hope you can hear me. I'm aware we're coming up to the hour now, and we still haven't had our keynote speech from General Richard. So I'm going to go over to Leslie Ann for that external perspective of what is the military advantage that she can see to the military dealing with this issue and coming to close with the issue of climate change and sustainability. And Leslie Ann, if I can ask you to perhaps tackle a question from our audience as well at the same time, or following on from that. And that question is, the way to lasting change is often through popular mobilization. Do you think there is a danger that using the language of security and war to frame the problem of climate change will lead to a more technocratic and less democratic approach to dealing with this problem, as has been the case in many conflicts in recent times? So 2 questions there. What military advantages are there? And then what are the dangers of using the language of security and war to frame this problem? Over to you, Leslie Ann.
Thank you. Right, so I think I'll be very quick about the military advantages because I think they have been clearly set out. I think there are plenty of military disadvantages to not adapting as quickly as possible. And I think, so we've been talking about the health security implications. I would just quickly perhaps note that climate change might also have direct impacts on British overseas territories. And I think that's also something to take into account when we're looking at the impacts of climate change, that in the UK will of course be important, but for our overseas territories will be even more important if we see aggravating tensions in territories that are disputed or an increased pressure in the rich marine biodiversity resources that those territories have. And I think the other point is also looking at what other countries are doing. And I think change and adaptation will need to happen at some point. So I think it's better to lead the way, because if we have competitors that are more active in reacting to climate change, this might have strategic implications for the UK's ability to project its global influence, and it might leave the door open to other state or even non-state actors to respond. In terms of a second question on popular mobilization and this question of security, I think it's an extremely good question, and I work on questions around democratization of climate policy. So I think it's very important to think about the kind of vocabulary that we use when we're describing the climate problem. And I think it has been very important to see the popular mobilization to push for change within governance in the past few years. Until very recently, climate change was only seen as an environmental problem, as a technical problem. And I think now we really understand that we also need public support and public acceptability of climate policies. It is true that the disadvantage of framing all this in with a security lexicon is that it kind of puts a distance. It makes it a bit technocratic. And I think we've seen that, for instance, in terms of international negotiations on climate change, when in Copenhagen in 2009, the discourse was very much about the threats that climate change represented. And to the general public, this is just too much, because then you think, well, I cannot do anything about this. This is just, if you're talking about an existential threat, who can tackle an existential threat, really? But then if you look at the discourse that happened at the Paris Conference of the Parties in 2015, the discourse was very different. It was about a green economy, about opportunities. And I think this is much more empowering. So I think it's also important to think about the disadvantages and advantages of using this security lexicon. I think one thing that is important when we're talking about security is that it means that both the Foreign Service and the Ministry of Defense are involved, and those officials tend to have more power than people working in the climate or environment sphere. So it's also a good way, by using this term, of having more influence at the governmental level. Over to you, Tammy.
Great, thank you very much, Lesley-Anne. Of course, really good to hear that external perspective on language in particular, because I think within the military, it is a world sometimes very much unto itself. But of course, we work and the military lives and operates in the outside real world. I mean, of course it does. So I'd like to ask the same question, if I may, Admiral, to you also with regards to the lexicon of war and security, and how does the military bridge to that civilian vocabulary? Should we be talking about competition? Should we be talking about fighting climate? How does that work within perhaps the naval side and more broadly? But a second question also for you, Admiral, from one of our listeners or those that have posed questions beforehand. And that second question is, what assessment has Defence made of the impact climate change will have on the Arctic and the consequent defence and security implications resulting from this? So 2 questions there, Admiral. One on the lexicon and language, and then secondly, the assessment that Defence might have done on the Arctic. Over to you.
Right, sorry, trouble unmuting there. So I got those 2 questions. Thanks, Tammy. So first of all, I think it's interesting to see how military and security language tends to be used across society to address challenges. I mean, look at the response to COVID-19. It's a war against a pandemic. It's a battle to get inoculations out there, or whatever it is. But I do think that's unhelpful when you're addressing an existential threat like climate change, because it does tend to polarize opinion, and this is something that needs collaboration both nationally and internationally, and therefore I think taking a bit of emotion out of the language is always helpful when you're trying to develop those relationships to solve a problem like climate change. And in terms of popular mobilization, I mean, I think that's the important thing about the Defence Green Network and the network we're trying to establish, is that you bind people in that way. And if you look at some of our sort of ecology or nature related organizations around the country, they recognize this connection between nature and people. And I think climate change is in the same guise, actually. We need to make that link to our people, and they will have many of the solutions to this. So I think there is a need to sort of almost popularize this and mobilize our workforce, because many of the solutions will come from them, whether it's ideas or behavior. And as I said at the start, I think this is also about being a responsible, ethical, and modern employer. And those who are thinking of joining the armed forces will look to us to respond to this problem, and will take account of how we are responding in making their decisions about their futures. Coming to your second question about the Arctic, there are some positive things, ironically, about access to the Arctic. So the Northern Sea route will become increasingly accessible, and we would expect to have freedom of navigation on the high seas through the Northern Sea route. That will make parts of the world where we routinely deploy to accessible more quickly, and therefore we'll be using less fuel and creating fewer emissions. But it will also result in competition, either for access to those areas and those sea routes, or access to the raw materials that then become accessible that perhaps weren't before. And that's what I was really alluding to in my point about geopolitics. And that will lead to competition. And we're already seeing nations competing for access to the Arctic. I think those sort of challenges will become more acute. And given the role that the armed forces play in the defence and security of the nation and the nation's strategic interests, you can see those sort of challenges, I think, coming to the fore more frequently, their profile being raised, and therefore I think defence has to recognise that and posture ourselves accordingly. I think we've lost Tammy. Maurice, do you want to take up the baton there? Because I know you have a view on the Arctic?
Thank you, sir. Yes. The Arctic, as the Admiral said, has got a multi-dimensional part of it to play. So there's obviously the natural sea lane piece, the competition for resources. I don't want to stand on General David's toes, but there's obviously a land perspective there, where, as you know, as the tundra melts, the ice melts, the snow melts, it's more difficult to move around on the land. And also, you've then got the significant problem potential of large methane gas release, which is not a particularly good environment to be operating in. So there's a land environment, and then there is an air environment perspective as well, which comes to it from the Arctic perspective. So, you know, as the Navy is trying to defend the sea lanes, the Air Force will also be providing the maritime patrol reconnaissance for the sort of the air overview. Our aircraft will be operating in a different environment in terms of the atmospheric environments. So again, we're looking at, you know, how is the atmosphere going to change in the next 30, 40, 50 years to make sure that our aircraft, our manned and unmanned aircraft, will be able to operate in support of our senior service and our land colleagues. So you know, the whole of the military is trying to take that into account, as well as the other extreme areas, you know, in around the equator, the hot and very potentially difficult, very difficult operating environments. Even in Cyprus, you know, our bases will get a lot hotter, so there may be more extreme heat days, which will bring heat stress. So we have to think about how our equipment and our people have to operate in these really extremes of weather. Over.
Thank you, Maurice, very much for coming in on that as well. We had a very similar question with regards to the Sahara. And I don't know if General David is still online. I can't quite see him. If he is, General David, maybe you can come in and answer that question on, you know, what has the military been able to do with regards to assessment of climate change with regards to the Sahara. And if you're not online, because I can't see you, maybe General Richard, you would be able to come in on that. And before long, we'll be moving over to your keynote speech as well.
I think General David is online. If you
Excellent.
can hear me, Tammy. General David, do you want to go on with that one?
So I think the question, to read back, Army's engagement in the Sahara, I mean, the headline is the Army has to stay in lane in terms of its role to protect the nation and serve from a security perspective UK interests. So overseas and in the UK. So it would not be a surprise to note that we don't have the lead role in assessing the state of climate change in areas outside our own national borders. I think what I would say is we in a organization with aspirations and ambitions for global reach and global presence, then it is important that we play a supporting role for those organizations that might have the lead in those areas. And I think it's really important that the military, in the same way that the MOD does not have a lead role by statute in UK resilience, the MOD provides support to other lead government departments to deliver UK resilience. So we're not a emergency responder like the three emergency services, and our military aid to civil authorities is very much slave to supporting as opposed to leading. The exact same logic is true for overseas, where we clearly have a key role to play. We must do no harm, and we must contribute to the sustainability agenda in those areas. But it would be inappropriate to suggest the military would take a lead role in assessing or analysing, nor would I suggest that that would require niche expertise, nor would I suggest it would be sensible for the MOD to claim it had that deep thematic expertise required. That's very different to playing our part in a supporting sense. So my final observation, MOUs and service level agreements with international bodies and international organisations are really important. It plays back to my observation for the department to ensure it looks outside of its own arena, its own specific discrete security arena, and looks at the dependencies and the connective tissues with those other organisations we work with. Thanks, Tammy. I'll hand back to General Richard.
Thank you very much, General David, certainly. Really great to hear some of the things that you're saying there with regards to conflict sensitivity, doing no harm, working with others across government. And I know we have some people online today from FCDO, from across the rest of government, and from the Climate Environmental Security Learning Journey that is gathering a number of people across government who do have the deep thematic expertise in this area, and how we move forward together. So with that, thank you very much to all of you for all that you have discussed over this last almost 90 minutes. I think one of the main things to have come out of all of this is, of course, how all of us, with our various bits of training, have managed to make, I think, this panel work just about, despite the technical difficulties. That is definitely thanks to some of the great support I've seen going on behind the scenes also. But I'd like to give the opportunity now to General Richard to come in and give his keynote address now at the end, because he has been the author of what is going to be a really game-changing review and strategy. And we are all ears, General Richard, to hear what you have to say. Over to you.
Tammy, thank you. Can I just check that people can hear me? If somebody could give me a thumbs up. Good, Morris. Thank you very much indeed. I was going to give a long chat about why this is relevant to defence, but I think you've heard from three practitioners in defence and Leslie Ann from outside defence as to why this is so important for defence. I've spent a lot of time in my report talking about that because I think it is really important that people understand that this is, to my mind, at any extent, not an option, but a requirement of defence to remain operationally capable. And it comes to my first point that I will make. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not something where the greener we are, the less military capable we are. You have heard from the analysts that actually what is going to make the big difference here in our military capability is embracing the technologies and the opportunities that come out of the green agenda. You've heard how hybrid vehicles, yes, they reduce emissions, but they also reduce the signature, and so they're more difficult for the enemy to find. You've heard how we're going to be able to operate in the Arctic from Admiral Andrew, and yet at the same time that's going to add competition. You've heard how we can increase our freedom of manoeuvre only if we embrace what happens as a result of climate change. So if we ignore this, I believe we will become a diminished force. We will be less capable than if we actually pay attention to what's happening to the environment around us. So it's not a zero-sum game. It is a win-win. If we pay attention to this, if we operate in an environment that is climate changed, then actually we will be able to improve our operational capability and be able to reduce our emissions. That's sort of the first point I would like to make. Second point, and it goes to one of the points that Morris made, which is that actually we're very good at this. What we do is we embrace new technology as it comes along. What I have not seen people talking about, but I would argue, is that we're in an energy revolution like we have not seen for 100 to 120 years. And that energy revolution is moving from almost 100% fossil fuels as the response to our energy requirements to a whole variety of different fuel capabilities that are going to be available. And so actually, why wouldn't we want to embrace that huge amount of change that's going on in energy? Not because we're embarrassed by the fossil fuels. It is a really strong moral argument that we shouldn't be using fossil fuels. Of course it is. But actually, new fuels offer different potential, offer different opportunities, and in some cases, and in many cases, I would argue, offer better opportunities. And so there is a really strong argument for saying that we should embrace what is going on in this revolution of energy in the next 10 to 15 years. Going to a point that David made in the chat, it's about, I have described it as a fast follower. We should not be spending defence R&D money on working out how the world's shipping should move from A to B more environmentally friendly, because that's not the role for the MOD. But what is the role for the MOD is making absolutely sure that as soon as the world has decided that it is going to go for a certain type of fuel for its engines, for its ships, that actually we jump on the bandwagon and we make the most use of it for our ships. In exactly the same way, we have said, and I'm sure this came out, that we have said that from we've changed the protocol in November last year, that we're prepared to accept 50% synthetic fuels in our aircraft to reduce the emissions. I personally believe and have been advised that we could get that to 100% in due course. But we can get there. We can use synthetic fuels and we can reduce our emissions. We have changed the protocol. That is a protocol that is affecting a number of other organizations within this country and elsewhere. But importantly, that has now given industry a really strong lead to push for a change in doing it and make it more economically viable. And the point is, synthetic fuels have existed for 80 years, but synthetic fuels that are green and synthetic fuels that are cheap enough to use is where we need to get to and where we need to put now. And my third point I would make is that it affects all of defence. This is not, and you have heard this in spades from the three practitioners on the call today. This is not just about our estate, which is where traditionally we have put our, if you like, what we've tried to do in this space. This is about better new equipment. This is about different types of aircraft. This is about different types of ships. This is about different types of land vehicles. It's about a whole approach to our procurement. It's about an approach to our assurance. It's about an approach to our commercial enterprise. And so in answer to one of the questions, yes, absolutely, we are turning round and we want to say, and we're trying to get the rest of government to agree with us on this, that you don't even bother bidding for us unless you can prove that you as a company are going to get to net zero in the future. And you have a plan to get to net zero in the future. Don't even bother bidding, because we're not going to look at you. That would be where I want to take it. It's not where government is at the moment, but it's where we need to get to, that for government contracts, you have to show that you have the capability of getting to net zero. And I'll answer very directly one question that came up in the chat about, is this all greenwashing? My whole campaign on this is about, we can get to net zero. Yes, we'll have to throw a double six every day for the next 30 years, but we can get to net zero as a department. How do we do it? We're not going to buy offsets on the market. That, I would say, is greenwashing. We don't want to do that. What we do want to do is use the 440,000 hectares of this country that we have responsibility for, the 2% of the land mass of this country, to be better sequester, to be better biodiversity, to be better environmentally friendly. And that we actually start to change the way we use our land. It still has a primary purpose of training estate or what we have our built estate on. But we start to change the way we use our land in order to improve biodiversity and environmental sustainability. And in that way, we will get to better sequestration as well. So we have a plan to plant 2 million trees in the next 5 years. We have a plan to plant millions of trees beyond that. We have a plan to change the grasses that we use and the way that we do our grasses. We have a plan to regenerate our peat bogs. We have a plan to produce wetlands. All of that improves our capability of sequester, which will go against the residual emissions that we are bound to have in 2050. Anybody who thinks that we're going to change the aircraft carriers' engines to make them green has another thing coming. That would be phenomenally, ridiculously expensive, but we still will have aircraft carriers in 2050. So what we've got to do is we've got to minimize the emissions from the aircraft carriers at the same time as making sure that that residue that we will still have in all probability is covered by our estate. And so there's a twin track approach here of sequester as much as we can and reduce our emissions as much as we can through the technology. A point somebody made in the chat, which was, isn't this all too late? Some of our equipment is still going to be around in 2050. Absolutely, yes, it is. But we change about 25% of our equipment every 10 years. And therefore, between now and 2050, in 30 years' time, we will have changed around about 75% of our equipment. That's really exciting. If you look at the equipment and the ships and the aircraft and everything that we had in 1990, which is the same distance from today as 2050 is, how much of our equipment that we went to the first Gulf War with is the same without change as we have today? I would argue very little, perhaps 25%. And therefore, we have opportunity as we buy new equipment over the next 30 years. We have opportunity to change the way we do business. We have opportunity to change the procurement. We have to change our assurance, our commercial, in order to make sure that actually we get down to our reduced emissions. And so what does my report do? It gives three broad statements that I think are valid all the way up to 2050. The first goes to the points Leslie Ann has been making so successfully all afternoon. It goes to the fact that climate and security is a thing. It wasn't being talked about in big terms about 18 months ago. But climate and security, the Prime Minister is majoring on climate and security in his speech to the UN Security Council in this month. We have climate and security coming into the Munich Security Conference. We have climate and security coming into various conferences between now and COP26. I'm trying to get climate and security into COP26 because it's important that people understand that climate change affects our security as a country and affects our security as individuals. And therefore, we need to understand it. We need to understand what we can do. We don't have all the answers yet. We don't want to be telling the world what to do in this space. But what we do want to do is make sure that the world understands that actually climate and security needs to be thought about and needs to be tackled. And so my first sort of ambition for 2050 is that the UK defence can act as and be recognised as a global leader in climate and security. And it's not more sophisticated than that, but my goodness, that should be something that we're aiming for. And I would argue very strongly that we will influence other people by our own actions. And we will influence the US, and we will influence NATO, and we will influence other alliances. If we take climate and security seriously, then I believe others will do so as well. The second ambition is very firmly, and the panel has talked about it a lot today, is very clearly to make sure that we have adapted our equipment so that we can operate more successfully in a climate changed world. And I won't dwell on that, but for me, that's really important. And the third is that we must contribute to the government's aim of getting to net zero by 2050. We already represent 50% of central government's emissions. So central government will not get to net zero unless we do something about it. I personally believe, and I think we have proven, that we as a department can get to net zero by using our landmass against our residual emissions. But whether the department will sign up to that or not is a matter for the department. What I would turn around and say, as an ambition, we must have this intent to try and reduce our emissions to as low as absolutely necessary in order to be able to support the planet and to provide an excellent example of where we are going and to provide an example to the rest of the world. So there are lots of questions in the chat which I was going to try and cover. I've produced a climate change strategy so that others beneath, as part of the Army, Navy, the Air Force, DNS and so on, can produce their own strategies. As long as they're in line, and you've heard all of the panel say that their strategies are in line with what I'm trying to do, with the priorities I've tried to set out, then actually it makes a lot of sense that we as defence work together on this. And I'm not going to tell them how to do business from the centre. What I'm going to do is turn around and say, this is where the approach we should be taking, this is where we should be going, and see how they, as individuals, as individual commands, individual services, how they take it forward. And I think we have a responsibility to answer another question, to lead our allies. Is this affordable is a really, really important question. And I'll finish on one final question after that. Is it affordable? Well, the answer is we have a lot of money. We have over £40 billion a year. So it is a question of priorities. And what I would argue is exactly what others have argued on this call, that if we don't start to deal with it today, we won't be able to deal with it tomorrow. And it will become increasingly expensive if we don't start now, because we'll have too much to do in too short a time. And so we have to make it affordable. We have to look at what we've been told to do, but B, what will give us the best return on our investment. And we have to think slightly longer than, let's say, 3 to 5 year return on investment. We have to think, if you think about it, an aircraft carrier, we're talking about a 30, 40, 50 year investment. And we're quite happy to make those decisions when it comes to capital equipment. We should be making the same sorts of decisions, perhaps 15, 20 year return on investment for some of the renewable energies and some of the things that we can do to try and reduce our emissions and improve our operational capability. That's where we should be going, rather than turning around and saying it's a bit too expensive. Everything's too expensive when you don't have enough money, but we need to make choices. And those choices should be looking at how we can get a return on investment. And I think the final question I would want to tackle before I stop is this thing about conflict, and about whether we should be looking at this worry about securitizing climate change, and that the military get involved and it's boots on the ground and so on and things like that. I would point to 2 points. The first is the military have a fantastic network around the world. When we're not fighting a military, we're usually friends with them and we're usually talking with them because we're very similar. And so we have really close links with, for example, the Navy has really close links with Chile. We have really close links with our European allies and our NATO allies. We have really close links with the Five Eyes community, which is New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America, and ourselves. We should be using those to get the message across to them if they need it, but I assure you they're on this path as well, that actually it is the responsibility of the militaries to reduce their own emissions, and it's the responsibility of the militaries to look at climate and security and understand what's going on. We may not be the answer, but by goodness, we have a part to play in that. And it's diplomacy, development, and defence that really makes a difference in climate and security. So absolutely, we have a duty to try and understand conflict as it affects us. But instead of securitization of climate, I would argue, and this is my final piece, that what we should be really doing is climatizing the security apparatus. We should be making sure that the security apparatus of every country absolutely looks at its responsibility to try and make sure that it reduces its emissions, it understands how to operate in a climate changed world, and starts to take a lead. As Leslie Ann mentioned, defence ministries across most of the world are a lot more powerful than environmental ministries. We should be taking the lead and turning around and saying, we're taking this seriously. Why don't you, government, in every country in the world? And I think that's an opportunity for defence to say, we're not just all about guns, we're not just all about ships and aircraft. Actually, we're about making sure that the world is a safer place. Because if the world is fighting, it is not thinking about climate change. If the world is peaceful, it has the opportunity and the space to think about climate change. And that's where we should be. Tammy, I'll stop there. Thank you.
General Richard, thank you very much for those words. Really some stirring sentiments there about how defence and the single services and those who work with defence can absolutely work together in this space. It has been a fantastic 90 minutes, and I know we have many questions from people, including things like, what can we as middle managers and junior people do to assist with this journey that we are going on. We have not been able to answer every single question, but I would certainly encourage everyone to put their questions in the YouTube chat that will be below this session. And for those who are inside the military, there are 2 or 3 forums actually that you can also get engaged in there. There's the Defence Green Network, and there is the Climate Security and Justice Forum on Defence Connect, which General Richard actively answers questions on those areas. So please do ask your questions there. And also from across government, the Climate and Environment Security Learning Journey is another place where there is quite a lot of discussion about these issues and what we can do about them. So with that, thank you very much to all of the panelists. It has been a really fantastic 90 minutes. I would be gunning for us to do this again at a later stage after the review has been published. And a big thank you also to the Wavell Room and to PS21 for asking us to deliver this event today. And of course, there will be further Wavell Room events in the future, the next one being on cyber. And so with that, watch this space, or watch the Wavell Room space and the PS21 space. And thank you very much again to everybody. We look forward to a continued dialogue on this extremely important topic. Thank you.